In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there existed a natural order that had persisted for over 50,000 years. It was a hierarchy as rigid as crystallized dark matter and about as pleasant to contemplate, if you happened to occupy one of the lower rungs. At the very top of this celestial food chain sat the Kythara Empire, a collection of beings so perfectly evolved for hunting that they made ancient Earth's apex predators look like particularly aggressive houseplants. The Kythara had turned predation into an art form, complete with philosophical treatises, annual competitions, and what could generously be called a cultural obsession with the concept of the perfect hunt. They possessed sensory organs that could detect fear-induced pheromone changes from 3-star systems away, reflexes that operated at quantum speeds, and a collective ego that could be observed from orbit without specialized equipment. Their hunting vessels were marvels of engineering, designed not merely to catch prey, but to do so with a certain aesthetic flourish that lesser species found both terrifying and oddly pretentious. For millennia, the Kythara had methodically worked their way through the galaxy's buffet of civilizations, categorizing each species according to their hunting potential. Some were classified as premium sport, species that provided an adequate challenge and satisfying conclusion. Others fell into bulk processing, civilizations that offered quantity over quality. The remainder were filed under decorative purposes only, which was exactly as ominous as it sounded. The system worked beautifully, at least from the Kythara perspective. They maintained their position through a combination of superior technology, ruthless efficiency, and what their philosophers called natural selection optimization, a fancy term for eating anything that might eventually become competition. Other species had learned to accept their role in this arrangement with the sort of resigned grace typically associated with livestock, which coincidentally was exactly how the Kythara viewed them. This delicate balance of terror had persisted across eons, unmarked by anything resembling effective resistance. The Kythara's hunting records were so comprehensive, they included detailed psychological profiles, preferred hunting seasons, and even wine pairing suggestions for post-hunt celebrations. Their supremacy seemed as inevitable as entropy itself, which made their eventual encounter with humanity all the more cosmically amusing. When the Kythara first detected signals from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, their response followed standard protocol. The initial assessment team catalogued humanity with their usual methodical precision: bipedal, technologically adolescent, possessing rudimentary space travel capabilities, and displaying an adorable tendency towards self-destruction. The preliminary report classified humans as moderate sport with novelty potential, which in Kythara terminology meant they'd provide a decent afternoon's entertainment before being processed into whatever passed for the galactic equivalent of a trophy room. The first hunting expedition launched with characteristic Kythara confidence. 3 vessels, each carrying the finest hunters the Empire could produce, equipped with technology that could crack planets and armed with the sort of casual arrogance that comes from 50,000 years of uncontested dominance. The hunt leader, a being whose name translated roughly to death which comes from above with proper documentation, had personally overseen the elimination of 67 civilizations. By all reasonable expectations, this should have been hunt number 68. The hunter's first mistake was assuming human behavior would follow predictable patterns. Their advanced algorithms, calibrated through millennia of successful predation, suggested that humans would respond to initial contact with either immediate surrender or organized resistance following established tactical doctrines. Instead, humans did something the Kythara databases had no classification for. They started making jokes. Commander Reese Vantok, a career military officer with the sort of bureaucratic stubbornness that could outlast geological processes, received the Kithara ultimatum with what could charitably be called professional interest. The message was standard hunter protocol: surrender peacefully for quick processing or resist pointlessly for extended recreational purposes. Vantok's response, transmitted across 17 star systems, consisted of 3 words that would eventually become legendary: come and take. The Kithara interpreted this as ritualistic pre-hunt posturing, a quaint display of species pride before inevitable capitulation. What they hadn't accounted for was humanity's peculiar relationship with the concept of losing gracefully. When the hunting vessels arrived in Earth's solar system, they found humans had spent their preparation time not fleeing or fortifying, but apparently building crude weapons and placing bets on the outcome. The actual hunting proved problematic from the start. Kithara tactics relied on predictable prey behavior: run in terror, hide in obvious locations, or attempt conventional military resistance. Humans, displaying what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness, did none of these things. Instead, they launched attacks that made no tactical sense, used strategies that violated basic military doctrine, and seemed to approach the entire situation as a combination of existential crisis and extreme sporting event. The failed hunt became the subject of incredulous discussion throughout Kithara society. The official report, heavily redacted for purposes of imperial dignity, mentioned unforeseen tactical complications and prey behavior outside established parameters. Unofficially, veteran hunters whispered about humans who had somehow managed to board Kithara vessels, not to surrender or sabotage, but apparently to offer their captors coffee and engage in philosophical discussions about the nature of predation. The Kithara Empire, being a civilization built on the principle of adaptive perfection, responded to their initial setback with characteristic determination. If humans had proven unexpectedly troublesome, the solution was obviously more thorough preparation. They commissioned detailed behavioral studies, upgraded their hunting algorithms, and assigned their most experienced predation specialists to what had become known throughout the Empire as the human problem. The second expedition arrived with considerably more firepower and infinitely more confidence. This time, the Kithara had accounted for human unpredictability by developing countermeasures for every documented form of unconventional behavior. Their new approach emphasized overwhelming force combined with psychological warfare designed to exploit human emotional responses. It should have been textbook predation, executed with the precision that had eliminated countless civilizations. Instead, humans displayed an even more disturbing tendency: they had been learning too. Not content with their initial success, humanity had spent the intervening months developing what could generously be called countermeasures, though increasingly creative forms of spite might have been more accurate. Where the Kithara expected fear, they found curiosity. Where they anticipated desperation, they encountered something resembling cheerful determination. The hunting vessels found themselves dealing with humans who had somehow managed to weaponize their own social behaviors. Kithara infiltration specialists, trained to exploit species-typical responses, discovered that humans had an alarming tendency to adopt their predators as mascots. Several hunter teams found themselves inadvertently integrated into human social structures, complete with designated feeding schedules and what appeared to be adoption papers. Commander Vantok, now elevated to something resembling folk hero status, had taken personal charge of human anti-hunting operations. His approach combined military pragmatism with what could only be described as profound pettiness. Rather than focusing on survival, human strategy seemed designed primarily to make the hunting experience as inconvenient as possible for the Kithara. They had apparently weaponized bureaucracy. Each subsequent hunting expedition met with increasingly elaborate forms of resistance. Humans had begun treating Kythara hunters not as existential threats, but as challenging puzzles to be solved through application of sufficient creativity and minimal regard for conventional logic. The hunters found themselves trapped in scenarios that violated everything they understood about proper predator-prey relationships. Some were subjected to lengthy presentations about human culture. Others found themselves enrolled in what appeared to be correspondence courses in human psychology. The third expedition returned with reports that strained credulity even by Kythara standards. According to the surviving hunters, humans had somehow managed to reverse-engineer Kythara technology, not to build better weapons, but to construct more efficient methods of inconveniencing their would-be predators. The hunting vessels had been tagged with what appeared to be primitive graffiti. Several hunters reported being forced to participate in human recreational activities, including something called karaoke night. The Empire's hunting manuals, previously considered definitive guides to galactic predation, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for dealing with a species that treated existential threats as opportunities for creative problem-solving. Worse, other civilizations had begun taking notice of humanity's peculiar approach to being hunted, and some were displaying disturbing signs of inspiration. By the fourth attempted hunt, something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between predator and prey. The Kythara, beings whose entire cultural identity revolved around hunting excellence, found themselves in the unprecedented position of being studied by their intended victims. Humanity had moved beyond mere resistance into what could only be described as active research, treating the Kythara Empire as a particularly interesting laboratory specimen. Commander Van Toke had assembled a team of humans whose qualifications seemed to consist primarily of advanced degrees in applied stubbornness and what military psychologists were beginning to classify as constructive sociopathy. This group had spent considerable time analyzing captured Kythara technology, communication patterns, and hunting methodologies. Their conclusions were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The Kythara were vulnerable to their own perfection. The hunter species had evolved in a universe where their supremacy was unquestioned, creating psychological blind spots that humans found both amusing and exploitable. Kythara hunters were trained to respond to predictable behaviors, but they had no protocols for dealing with prey that actively studied their predators with the sort of academic interest typically reserved for particularly interesting bacteria. Humanity's counter-hunting program launched with characteristic human disregard for conventional wisdom. Rather than attempting to match Kythara technological superiority, they focused on psychological warfare designed around a simple premise: if you can't beat them, make them question their entire worldview. Human teams began actively pursuing Kythara hunters, not to destroy them, but to subject them to intensive cultural exchange programs. The results exceeded even human expectations. Kythara hunters, confronted with prey that insisted on treating them as potential friends rather than existential threats, began experiencing what their psychologists eventually classified as predator identity crisis syndrome. Some hunters found themselves reluctantly impressed by human ingenuity. Others became inadvertently fond of their intended victims. A few experienced complete psychological breakdowns when humans presented them with carefully researched arguments about the philosophical implications of predation as a lifestyle choice. The most successful human anti-hunting team, led by Dr. Elena Kowalski, had developed what they called aggressive befriending tactics. Their approach involved capturing Caithara hunters and subjecting them to intensive courses in human culture, complete with home-cooked meals, family photos, and detailed explanations of human social bonding mechanisms. The psychological impact on beings bred for solitary hunting proved devastating. Kowalski's team had discovered that Caithara hunters were particularly vulnerable to human pack bonding behaviors. Exposure to human social structures caused measurable changes in Caithara brain chemistry, leading to what could only be described as involuntary adoption responses. Several captured hunters had to be physically restrained from returning to their vessels to collect personal belongings before moving in with their human pack. The galactic community watched these developments with the sort of fascinated horror typically reserved for cosmic catastrophes. Other species began quietly updating their own assessment of humanity, moving them from primitive prey to things we probably shouldn't mess with. The Caithara, for their part, found themselves in the unprecedented position of having their hunters actively hunted by prey that seemed to consider the entire situation an elaborate form of entertainment. The final confrontation came when the Caithara Empire dispatched their elite hunting force, a group whose members had never failed to claim their intended prey. These were beings so perfectly adapted for predation that they were considered living weapons, creatures whose very existence served as proof of Caithara evolutionary superiority. Their mission was simple: restore the natural order by demonstrating that humanity, regardless of their peculiar tactics, remained fundamentally prey. The elite hunters arrived to find that humanity had spent their preparation time not building defenses or fleeing to distant star systems, but apparently organizing what could only be described as a welcoming committee. Earth's orbital facilities had been decorated with what appeared to be festive banners. Radio transmissions from the planet's surface suggested that humans were treating the final hunt as some sort of cultural celebration. Commander Vantok, now bearing the self-appointed title of Chief Human Inconvenience Coordinator, met the Caithara ultimatum with an invitation to dinner. The response so thoroughly violated established predator-prey protocols that several hunters experienced immediate psychological distress. The elite force found themselves confronted with prey that had somehow managed to reverse the fundamental assumptions underlying 50,000 years of successful hunting. The humans had prepared a demonstration designed to illustrate their new understanding of the galactic food chain. They had captured and domesticated several previously unknown apex predators, creatures that had terrorized entire sectors of the galaxy. These beings, which had once inspired species-wide evacuations, were now wearing what appeared to be identification collars and responding to human commands with enthusiastic compliance. Dr. Kowalski presented the elite hunters with a comprehensive analysis of Caithara psychology, complete with recommendations for psychological treatment and dietary supplements. Her team had concluded that the hunter species suffered from chronic loneliness masked by predatory behavior, a condition that could be effectively treated through exposure to human social structures and regular participation in community activities. The demonstration concluded with humanity's ultimate revelation. They had become something the galaxy had never seen before. Not prey that had learned to defend themselves, not a species that had achieved technological parity with their predators, but beings who had weaponized their own capacity for emotional connection. Humans had discovered that everything in the universe, given sufficient exposure to human social behaviors, could be domesticated. The elite hunting force surrendered not through defeat in combat, but through what could only be described as involuntary adoption. Confronted with prey that insisted on treating them as potential family members, the hunters found their predatory instincts overwhelmed by responses they had no evolutionary framework for processing. Several were discovered attempting to help humans with their daily activities. Others had begun expressing concern about human nutritional habits and sleep schedules. The Caithara Empire officially reclassified humanity from prey species to existential hazard, and issued standing orders for all Imperial vessels to avoid human-controlled space, unless specifically equipped with psychological countermeasures and emergency therapy protocols. 3 standard galactic years after first contact, the universe had quietly rearranged itself around a new reality. The great predator hierarchy that had dominated interstellar relations for millennia now included an addendum that most species preferred not to discuss directly. Humans were not to be hunted under any circumstances, not because they were too dangerous to hunt, but because they were too dangerous to hunt successfully. The Kythera hunting manual, once considered the definitive guide to galactic predation, now contained a single chapter devoted to humanity. The entire section consisted of 2 words: just don't. Attempts to expand this guidance had resulted in psychological trauma among the manual's editorial staff, leading to the current policy of deliberate ignorance regarding human anti-hunting capabilities. Other predator species had begun displaying disturbing signs of what xenopsychologists termed humanity avoidance syndrome. Several previously aggressive civilizations had voluntarily relocated to distant sectors rather than risk inadvertent contact with humans. The few species that maintained diplomatic relations with Earth did so through heavily screened intermediaries and insisted on conducting all meetings in neutral territory. Commander Vantok had achieved legendary status throughout the galaxy, not as a military hero but as the being who had somehow managed to domesticate an entire predator species through the strategic application of social pressure and home-cooked meals. His autobiography, titled How to Win Friends and Influence Apex Predators, had become required reading in xenopsychology programs across 17 different academic institutions. The ultimate irony was not lost on those few galactic historians brave enough to document these events. Humanity, a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel, had managed to revolutionize galactic power structures not through superior technology or military prowess, but by treating the universe's most feared predators like particularly large, misunderstood pets in need of proper socialization. The few Kythera hunters who had survived extended exposure to human culture now served as unofficial ambassadors between their empire and the rest of the galaxy. They could be found throughout Imperial space, enthusiastically explaining human social customs to anyone willing to listen and displaying what could only be described as pride in their adopted human families. Several had started support groups for beings experiencing difficulty adjusting to post-hunting life. The galaxy had learned a fundamental lesson that would reshape interstellar relations for generations to come. There are fates worse than being hunted, and one of them is being befriended by humans with sufficient determination and access to comfort food. The species that had once occupied the bottom of the galactic food chain had managed to claim the apex position through the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge that they were supposed to be prey. In the end, humanity's greatest weapon had proven to be their inability to properly respect the established order of things, combined with an alarming tendency to adopt everything they encountered. They had become the predator that could not be hunted, not because they were too strong, but because they were too persistently friendly to survive contact with. The universe, it seemed, had developed a sense of humor.